Well, as I was saying, it is great to be back with you here this morning after a few weeks of our family dealing with all the effects of COVID and everything like that. And thank you so much for your prayers and for thinking of us. And it is good to be back and good to be cleared finally and all of that good stuff. But all of this the last couple of weeks just kind of reminded me of something that's kind of interesting. And that's this. You know, sometimes things in life, they can blindside you. Do you ever feel like that? You're kind of going along and everything seems smooth, and then wham, you know, something just knocks you and you didn't expect it. And you're just like, this is the last thing I need, you know? And you didn't plan for it, you can't control it, and something just happens. And that's kind of how the last few weeks were for me, and dealing with some of this, and and being locked down and then testing positive, and didn't even have any symptoms. And that's kind of what made it worse, I guess, and felt more blindsided, is because you can't do anything, and you can't be where you want to be, which was here, you know, and you're kind of stuck home, and you just kind of feel trapped. Because things happened differently than the way you wanted or the way you planned. But you know what? That's life, isn't it? That's the way life often works. You know, things happen to us. Sometimes they're planned. Most of the time, things that happen aren't planned. Sometimes things are good. Other times they're challenging. But most of all, here's the truth about life. Life keeps humming along. Life doesn't just stop, you know, and go on pause for us. It kind of keeps going along. And in fact, you know, when we in our life face these kind of challenges that come to us that we didn't plan for or we didn't expect, we find ourselves at a crossroad. Do you know that? When we kind of hit these things that blindside us. And here's the crossroads. Do we let these things derail us and just fall apart? Or do we keep trusting God even when it's not easy? Well, this is where we find ourselves this morning as we embark on a brand new journey, a new series through the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. So if you have your Bibles, why don't you turn to chapter 1 of Exodus? I know last week Chuck kind of gave us a little introduction to to Exodus in his message on God the Great I Am. But we're going to kind of start back in the beginning of the book so we can understand this story of Exodus. And the stories from the book of Exodus, they're probably familiar to most of us, aren't they? Some of these things, some of these events that have happened, in fact, a lot of the events have been depicted in movies. Movies like The Prince of Egypt or The Ten Commandments, you know, with Charlton Heston, and all of these things. So we're familiar kind of with the gist of, oh, that's an Exodus. But you know what? There is so much more to Exodus than just parting seas and stone tablets. Or even the story of just a group of people who lived, you know, over 3,500 years ago. There's so much more to Exodus than that. Because Exodus, in addition to being a historical narrative of things that actually happened, the message of Exodus is also for our lives today. Because in this book, we are going to discover some of the challenges and some of the blessings that come with following a faithful God. Through any circumstance that we may face, good and bad, challenging ones, easy ones. But these challenges in life that can kind of sometimes make us doubt that God is watching or that God is in control or that God even cares for us. And the book of Exodus talks about how we can keep following God in this. Following this faithful God. So with all that said, we're just going to jump right in, okay? Into the book of Exodus, and we're going to kind of introduce our whole series this morning as the book of Exodus kind of gives us an introduction. So let's read, starting in chapter 1, and we'll kind of take it to where it takes us and see what God has for us in His Word. It begins like this. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now when Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. And I think we're going to stop right there this morning, because what we have here in these first 7 verses of Exodus is kind of, it provides for us a setting for everything that follows after it. Everything in this book, in this amazing story of God's faithfulness. So here in these verses, we learn of a family, right? These sons of Jacob living down in the country of Egypt. And this is around 1500 BC, so it's at the height of the Egyptian empire. I mean, pyramids and pharaohs and all of that stuff, right? Where they were a world power. And we learn of this family that now lives there. These people, the sons of Jacob, or as they're called, the sons of Israel, because Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So what's the big deal about this family? How did they get here at this time and place? And this is what we learned this morning, and what we're going to find out this morning as we begin. So, as we look at this passage, I want you to notice how it begins. It says, these are the sons, right? Now, some versions of the Bible don't have it quite like that. They say, and these are the sons, or now these are the sons. And actually, that's closer to what was originally written. You know, the Bible, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew, if you look at what the Hebrew says, it begins with these words, and now these are the sons of Jacob. And that's kind of important. And a lot of these narratives in the Bible begin like that, you know, and therefore this happened. And they begin like that, and you're just like, well, that's kind of a weird way to start this book, and unless we understand that Exodus is a part of something much bigger. Yeah, it's part of the Old Testament, it's part of the Bible, but it's a part of these first five books of the Bible called the Pentateuch. They were all written by Moses. And these books of the Bible, originally when Moses wrote them, they weren't individual books. What it was one story. So when it kind of starts, and now, it's connecting it to what was before it. And that's important because what we learned today is connected to something that already happened back in how it's been divided now in the first book of the Bible, which is Genesis. So in order to kind of understand this setting of Exodus, or where we find ourselves now, it helps for us to look back and understanding where we are now. So the book of Genesis. Now Genesis, the name Genesis, literally means origins, or things that came about or came in. And that's what Genesis refers to. And we went through the book of Genesis over a couple years, and really the book of Genesis deals with the origin of many things, or the entering in of many things. I mean, Genesis begins, right, and there's nothing but God. And then God speaks into the darkness, right, and he says, let there be light. So God then, there's the origin of light, and then this earth, this world, right? Land and sea and plants and animals, and then human beings are brought into existence, right? Brought in. And then at the end of this creation, God declares all that he has created very good. It's perfect. So mankind is in the garden, right? Having fellowship with God. And then something else enters in to this world. And it's something horrible. It's sin, right? Sin now enters this perfect creation. One of the fallen angels, Satan, in the form of a serpent, comes and visits Adam and Eve, and he tempts them to disobey God. And they eat the forbidden fruit, and sin enters the world. And sin enters human beings, along with death. And this sin created all kinds of evil, right? Led to all kinds of evil, and more evil grew, so much so that God decides, I'm going to destroy all of mankind with a flood. So he gets ready to have the flood, but yet he saves one family. Noah and his family, right, are spared from this death. So then enters in something very interesting by God, is salvation. And it's brought in, right, that God is the only one who can save. So he brings them through, and then they start back over again, and they're fruitful, and they multiply, and all of this we learn in Genesis. And then enters in something else, a guy. His name is Abram, right? It's actually a guy and his wife, Abram and Sarai. And right in chapter 12 of Genesis, we find something very interesting, that God comes and visits Abram. And here's what he says to him in Genesis chapter 12. He says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" So here God gives promises to this guy, Abram. It's actually a covenant that God makes, which is like a binding contract. And he says, "These I will do for you." And basically, God is promising Abram three things that are very important. First, he says, "Abram, I'm going to give you land, a place that is your own." Okay, it's this promised land, the promised land of Canaan in the ancient world, right? Then he says, "I'm also going to promise you descendants. I'm going to make of you a great nation." Okay, a multiple people. So I'm going to make of you a great nation. And then the third promise he gives them, also, it's a promise of blessing. I'm going to bless you so that you'll be great, but also all the families or all the nations of the whole world will be blessed through you or through your descendants that I'm going to give you. You see, through Abram's line, and we learned this when we went through Genesis, comes Jesus, God in the flesh, who comes to deal with sin that has entered this world, right? Sin and death that enters this world. Now, through the line of Abram, God becomes man and deals with sin, right? Offering salvation, forgiveness of sin, and a restored relationship that was broken because of sin. And he offers that as a gift. So that's this promise to Abram, this promise that God gives, or this covenant. So God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. And he brings Abraham and Sarah into this promised land of Canaan. So he's already starting to fulfill his promise. Yet there was one big problem. Abraham and Sarah were both pretty old. They were too old to have kids. And Sarah, anyway, was barren her whole life and she could never have kids. Yet God promised them multiple descendants, that they would fill the earth, that from them would become a great nation. Yet they didn't have any kids. How could this happen? So you know what Abraham does? He takes matters into his own hands, and he has a child through a surrogate, through one of Sarah's servants, and she has a son. But you know what? God reminds Abraham, this is your way. This isn't the child of blessing, or that my promise is going to come through, because I will be faithful to you. In fact, God is faithful, and Sarah ends up having a kid. She has a son, and his name is Isaac. So now God is showing himself faithful, right? So Isaac grows into a man, and he soon marries. But he has the same problem his parents had, in that his wife, Rebekah, also is barren, and she can't have kids. How will this then happen? Yet God was faithful. And sure enough, he tells them, Rebekah is going to not only have one son, she's going to have twins. And God actually tells Rebekah that the child of promise won't be the older son, as is the culture or the way at the time. It's going to be the younger son. The one who's born second is going to be this child of promise. So sure enough, she has twin boys, Esau and Jacob. And she remembers God's promise. She tells Jacob, and Jacob and her, though, instead of waiting for God, take matters into their own hands. And Jacob steals Esau's birthright through deception. When Esau finds out, he's furious, right? And Jacob is forced now to flee for his life. It seems like everything's falling apart. And Jacob goes back to the land of his fathers, and he's living with his uncle. And he falls in love with a girl. Her name is Rachel. And he wants to marry Rachel. So he works 7 years for his uncle, and the wedding day comes, and his uncle sneaks Rachel's older sister Leah in instead of Rachel, and deceives him. And he ends up marrying Leah, and he's like, wait, this isn't the woman I love. He goes, well, you can marry Rachel too, but you got to give me another 7 years of labor. So for 14 years he works for his uncle. And you know what, though? God blesses him. And God is faithful. And he starts to have sons through Leah. And it's awesome. Yet the wife that he loves the most is barren, and she can't have kids. So they take their matters into their own hands, and she offers up a surrogate, one of her servants, and he starts to have some sons through her. Leah sees this and gets jealous, offers up one of her servants as a surrogate, starts having more sons through this other servant, and the family begins to grow. And then finally, God works, and Rachel has a child. His name is Joseph. And then she has another child, and his name is Benjamin, but Rachel dies while giving birth to Benjamin. So Jacob is crushed, but he has these two sons. As a matter of fact, he loves his firstborn son through his wife that he loves, Joseph. He loves him the best. And soon Jacob says, you know what? God's been faithful. I'm going to go back to the land that he promised me. And he starts to go back to Canaan. Before he enters Canaan, God takes him outside and he reminds him of the promise that he gave to his grandfather. And he says, you know, through your line, you're going to be blessed. You're going to make of you a great nation, and I'm going to give you land, and all nations of the world will be blessed through you. And then he changes Jacob's name to Israel. Said, this is who your descendants will be known as, the sons of Israel. And Jacob goes back into the land, and they're living, and everything's going great. But yet, because Joseph was the favored son, Jacob spoils him. So much so that the brothers notice, and they're like, this isn't fair. And they get jealous. One day when Joseph goes out to see his brothers as they're working out in the fields, his brothers rise up in jealousy and they beat him up, and then they leave him for dead and sell him to passing traders along the way as a slave. Then they go tell Jacob that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. So Jacob's just despondent. But yet God is faithful. You see, Joseph then is taken by these traders and he's sold as a slave in Egypt. And he said, well, this is the end of Joseph. And he sold as a slave to one of Pharaoh's chief officials. But you know, God proves himself faithful even with Joseph as a slave. And he begins to bless Joseph in his new role as this slave and servant in the house. In fact, he begins to bless the household of this official, just as he had said to Abraham, that I will make you a blessing, and everybody who comes in contact with you is going to be blessed. And he's doing awesome. Until one day, the official's wife makes advances on Joseph, and Joseph refuses them, and she gets mad, accuses him of trying to rape her, and he is now falsely accused and thrown into prison in Egypt, in the darkest, deepest part. There and forgotten, you would think. Yet you know what? God is faithful. And God begins to bless Joseph even in prison, and he becomes one of the chief prisoners of all these people, and they keep coming to him, so much so that he catches the notice of the Pharaoh, of the king. And one day the Pharaoh has a dream and needs to know what it means, and he calls up Joseph. And Joseph tells him, you just had a dream that there's a famine coming. You have 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of a great famine, and you need to be prepared. And Pharaoh said, you know what, Joseph? You're the only one who's been able to tell me this. I'm going to bring you out of prison, and I'm going to promote you to an official. In fact, you are second only to me in the land of Egypt. And you're in charge of everything having to do with this famine. Isn't that amazing? God says, I will bless you. I will make your name great. And I will bless all those around you. So God raises Joseph up, and now he's this official, second in command in all of Egypt. And the famine comes, and Egypt's prepared. But it starts to go worldwide, this famine. In fact, it starts to happen up in Canaan. And Jacob's family starts to have need, and they're like, what are we going to do? And Jacob hears, well, I heard there's food in Egypt. So he sends his sons down to Egypt and says, you need to go get me food. And they're brought before the chief official so that they can purchase food. And that chief official happens to be their brother, Joseph. They don't recognize him. He recognizes them. Through a long series of events, Joseph finally reveals himself to his sons and says, I'm your brother who you sold into slavery, who you left for dead. They're fearful for their lives. And Joseph tells them, you know, you meant this for harm. God meant it for good because he's faithful. He meant it for your salvation. I'm here to save you. And he gives them food. And then he says, I want you to go and get your families and go get our dad and bring them down here to Egypt. You can live here in the best of the land throughout this famine, and you will be good. And then what happens is that they all come down into this land, 70 in all, as we learn in our passage today, right? And they go and they live in this land of Egypt, safe, because God is faithful. Now fast forward about 350 to 400 years. They're still in Egypt. The famine's long gone, yet this family is still in Egypt. And that's where we find them this morning. But we see and hear God is faithful over and over again. So anyway, this is the origins, right? The Genesis. So I just went through the whole book of Genesis, 50 chapters in a couple minutes. Isn't that cool? I don't know why we took so many weeks to do it before. But anyway, but it's the origins, right? The entering in of creation, of sin, of God's promise of salvation, and then the entering in of God's people as a nation. Strangers, though, living in a strange land. Now fast forward, and about 350 to 400 years, and we're at the beginning of Exodus in our passage today. Now, while the word Genesis, it means entering in or origins, you know the name Exodus means to bring out. To bring out now. Because Exodus is a journey, and it retells a journey of how God brought out his people of promise, this family of Abraham, out of Egypt and back into his promised land for them. In fact, Joseph notes this at the end of Genesis, right at the end, a couple verses from the end. In chapter 24, verse 50, he talks with his brothers right before he's about to die. He says, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And he reminds them, God will bring us out, or exodus us. And I want you to know that. So here we have it, right? This family of promise, the sons of Jacob, or Israel, strangers in a strange land, 12 sons and their families, as we find today, numbering 70 in all. And this is where they begin, in Egypt. So, with all of that said, what do we learn from this, right? What do we learn from what we read this morning about this background and this opening illustration? Well, you know, the story of Exodus, it's about so much more than God just delivering these descendants of Abraham out of Egypt. You see, Exodus really provides us a picture of salvation, of being delivered out of sin and into our relationship with God. And that's really what Exodus paints, God delivering his people out so that they can be with him, worship him, and follow him. So for us, Exodus gives us a picture of us and our relationship with God coming in. You know, we're strangers in a strange land, far away from home, right? Separated from God through sin, yet God is faithful. He delivers us out through Jesus, offers us salvation from our sin, saving us so that we can now walk with him. So, it's in this journey, right? It's in this journey of this Israelite nation now, or God and his people Israel, right? That we can learn how to better follow God in our relationship with him. As we face challenges and as we face uncertainty, and as we face things that the children of Israel, as Exodus talks about, that they face, and hardship in life, and things that, you know, hit them out of left field and catch you off guard. And through this story of God's people, we learn some of the good things we can do to follow God, and some things we probably shouldn't do in following God, or we should avoid. But it all starts here with the stage being set here in these first 7 verses. You see, in these first 7 verses, what the stage is set for Exodus, and everything that follows after it is this: God is faithful. And because God is faithful, when he leads us, we can follow him. So this is what we learn. We learn about the faithfulness of God this morning. He was faithful to Abraham. He's faithful to Abraham's descendants. And he's faithful to us today. In fact, what we learn about the faithfulness of God, I really want to talk to you about today from our passage, because it provides the groundwork for this journey, right? Through Exodus and this journey of following Jesus that hopefully going to help us follow Jesus better in our own lives. You see, from our passage, we learn this, that we can trust God in any circumstance, in anything we face, because first of all, as our passage says, God is faithful, or God's faithfulness is assured. Do you know that? This is what we learn about God's faithfulness in these first 7 verses. That God's faithfulness is assured. God is always faithful, and He will always be faithful. It's something that we can count on. It's something that the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, had learned, that no matter what things look like, God will never forget them. Over and over again, since God first gave this promise to Abraham, He proved Himself faithful to this promise, didn't He? I mean, Sarah can't have a kid. Well, we'll change that. You know, Jacob is running for his life, and he messed up too bad for God to be able to work and this promise to ever go through him. No, not necessarily. God is faithful, right? Joseph is sold as a slave, and now he's in prison. Certainly, it stops there. Yet, God is faithful. God is still working, and God is ever faithful. You see, God always keeps His promises and always does what He says He's going to do. And the family being in Egypt at the beginning of Exodus is a testament to that truth. And that truth holds for us, our lives today, even. That what God promises, He will do. God promises when we come to faith in Him, He promises several things. He promises eternal life. He promises He'll always be with us. And Paul notes a few things in Philippians. He says, first of all, I'm also sure of this. Take it to the bank. That He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. God's going to work in us. God's going to complete His work in us. And He's always going to be working in us and through us. And not only that, a little later in Philippians, God says, and also my God will supply every need of yours according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus. These we can be assured with, that God is faithful. God will be with us. When God saves us, He really does save us, and we are saved. We are forgiven, no matter what. And He's going to work in us to complete or accomplish what He wants to accomplish. And along the way, He's going to provide for us. Just as we just sang, He is our portion. And over again through Exodus, we're going to see that God is their portion, their provider of the Israelites. But God is with us. God is faithful. He's what He says He will do, so He will save us, He will be with us, He will work in us, and He will preserve us with Him through anything that we face in life. We can be assured of this, that God is faithful. Now, we not only learn that in our passage, we learn something else about God's faithfulness. Not only is it assured, but God's faithfulness is also unconditional. Did you know that? God's faithfulness to us, God's faithfulness to the children of Abraham and his descendants was unconditional. When Paul speaks of God's salvation in Ephesians, he notes something very important in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, for by grace you've been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing, it's a gift of God, not a result of works so that no one may boast. This idea of grace, this undeserved favor of God, this unearned favor of God. Grace is present in salvation, but grace is also present in our passage this morning. You see, it kind of oozes from this list of names that we have. We have names of Jacob and Reuben and Judah and all these sons, right? Because this list that we have this morning of Jacob and his sons, it's really a list of some pretty big-time sinners. Do you know that? I mean, we heard about Jacob. He was kind of a worm to his family, to his brother, and lied and stole and all of these things, right? Yet God still worked. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, You know, he slept with his daughter-in-law thinking she was a prostitute. Yet God still worked. God was still faithful. Levi and Simeon, you know, their little sister got assaulted by these guys in the city. And so out of revenge, they went and hot-headed and went and killed all the men of a city. Just murdered them. Then there's Reuben, you know, he's the oldest son. He slept with his father's concubine. And the list goes on with these guys. And we see it in Abraham where he took matters into his own hand. They're not perfect. They were sinful. They failed. They had times where they didn't trust God. Does it sound like our lives? I know it sounds like mine. Yet God remained faithful to them and faithful to his promise because his faithfulness wasn't conditioned on their faithfulness, but his. And this is true for God's love for us as well. It's not about our love for him, it's about his love for us. Paul talks about that in Romans. He says, you know, but God shows his love for us that while we were still sinners, while we were at our worst, while we were in open rebellion against God, Jesus died for us. He gave his life so that we could have life. Did we deserve that? No way. Were we worthy of that? No, except that he made us worthy. Because it's not conditioned. God is faithful even when we aren't. You know, he's strong when we're weak. And he is perfect when we're not perfect. You see, God is faithful in our lives because he is a faithful God. God is not a faithful God because we're faithful and earn that. He's giving us what we earned. No, God gives us his blessings and is with us because he is a faithful God. It's unconditioned on us. Just as this promise to Abraham wasn't conditioned on anything. He didn't say, Abraham, you can have all these things if you do these things first. If you buck up, if you show yourself worthy. No, God made him worthy. We don't make God faithful, he already is. And you know what this means for our lives in following him? This means that we fall down, we can get back up. Because God hasn't gone anywhere. God hasn't said, you know what, one more time, you do this one more time and that's it. God never says that about us. Do you know that? I'm out of here. No. God says, I'm going to love you and I'm going to keep loving you. It means that we can always reach out to him knowing he's always going to be there. He says, I'm not going anywhere. Even when you feel all alone, I'm right there for you. Because God's faithfulness is unconditional. God's faithfulness is unconditional. Isn't that awesome? And it's important that we know that truth as we go into this story of Exodus. So God's faithfulness is unconditional and it's assured. Now I want you to notice, back to our passage, look at the last verse of the passage, because this is very interesting. So we heard about all these guys and all of this, and that Joseph was already in Egypt, so that he didn't need to be brought in. But anyway, they all come in, right? And it says this in the last verse, but the people of Israel, so all these descendants now, were fruitful and they increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. You see, you know what this means? God's faithfulness is not only assured and unconditional, God's faithfulness is immeasurable. It goes far beyond what we could ever think or hope that God could do. God can do more. It's interesting because throughout the book of Genesis, you know what this family's history is marked by? Infertility, isn't it? They're having trouble having kids. Now we get to Exodus and what happens? They can't stop reproducing. I mean, they're popping out kids everywhere, right? They're growing mightily, so much so that they're strong and they're filling this land. Boy, what a change this is, isn't it? Why? Because God can do that. In fact, a little bit later in Exodus, we find out how many of these sons of Abraham were really in Egypt. It talks about that in chapter 12, and it says, you know, these people that left Egypt, that God brought out of Egypt, it says was about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. So if you have 600,000 men, and then you have women and children, we're talking over 1.5 million people, easily. came from one guy and his barren wife, Abraham. You don't think God can do more? See, this is what we learn here. That there was a time Abraham, he was childless, right? And he has this promise of God and says, how is this promise ever going to happen? And one night he said to Abraham, Abraham, go outside with me. And he says, I want you to look up. See those stars? Your descendants are going to outnumber those stars. Bank on it. Now I imagine Abraham's looking at that and going, I'd settle for one. God says, no, my faithfulness is immeasurable. It's so much more than you could ever imagine. You see, and it's beginning to happen, we see in our passage today, that God is faithful to do more. And God works in our lives like this, being faithful in more ways than we can imagine, and in different ways than we could think. Paul in Ephesians says this, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly, more than we could ask or think, according to his power at work within us. Nothing is impossible for God. There's no obstacle too great, no wrong so bad that he can't change it, no work that he can't do in our lives that's beyond his power. God's faithfulness is limitless. And it never, ever ends. So that we aren't going to say, well, God, you've done this. I guess that's what I got to settle for. No, God says, no, I'm going to keep being faithful. And I'm going to show my faithfulness. In fact, this means that God is never done working both for us and in us to shape us, to mold us into who he's designed us to be. We don't have to settle in life. God says, no, I'm going to be faithful. And I'm going to keep growing you. And I'm going to keep working. Why? Because God is faithful. Now, just because God's faithful and his faithfulness is assured and it's unconditional and it's immeasurable, this doesn't mean that life is always going to be easy. Do you know that? How many people say life is really easy? Life is not easy, is it? It just keeps coming, like we talked about. And there's things that happen to us that we don't plan, that we don't count on, that we don't necessarily choose. But it comes. We begin to see this in Exodus, beginning next week with these sons of Abraham, with this Israelite nation. That even though God is blessing them, things aren't always easy. In fact, life gets challenging for Israel. And in the same way, our lives, they're not always going to be easy. We won't always be strong. We won't always be successful in everything we do. We won't always be perfect, even no matter how much we try. Yet God is still faithful. He is strong. He is successful. He is perfect for us. You see, God is faithful. So how do we respond? How do we respond to an ever-faithful God? Well, it's very simple, and this is what we discover in in Exodus. We follow him. This is all that God wants of the children of Israel, is for them to follow him. We follow him. We cling to him. When Jesus called his first disciples, and he called these first fishermen to be his disciples, he didn't say, all right, guys, I want you to go to school and I want you to prepare yourselves. I want you to earn enough money so you can make sure you have money for the travels, or I want you to be better public speakers and I want you to have experience. Do you know what he said to these fishermen? He gave them one thing for them to do. In Mark chapter 1, he said, follow me. And then you know what he says? And he says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. You see, when we follow God, we discover a faithful God. God promises to work. And he's going to work in us and he's going to work through us. Just as he did with the children of Israel, just as he did with his disciples, he's going to do with us. And he says, here's what I want you to do. Follow me. So this is why our whole series through Exodus is called Exodus, following a faithful God. We're to be following, clinging to God, trusting His power, trusting His plan, trusting His promise for us. Because this is what God desires for us, is to follow Him because He is faithful. So, that sets the stage now for everything that comes after now in Exodus. And it's going to be an amazing journey. In fact, come back next week because things immediately start to get a little bumpy for the Israelites. Just like our own lives. You're going to leave here today and you know what? You may run out of gas on your way home or run over a nail, or tomorrow you're going to go to work and something that you had thought you had planned out just goes awry. And you're going to say, what just happened? Everything was going so well. Why? Because life is bumpy. Yet God is faithful. Let's pray.